If you want to take your melodies from sounding like this to sounding like this, this is the video for you. I'm gonna be teaching you how to make fire chord progressions, master sound selection, how to mix your melodies, and at the very end, I'm gonna give you a bunch of super saucy and really easy to use tips that you can start using today to make your melodies sound more interesting and more fire. So whether you're a complete beginner making melodies or you're just looking to level up, this video will have something for you. And we have a ton to cover, so let's get right into it. To start off, we need to understand a little bit of basic music theory. And I promise this video won't be a super boring, long, generic video where I'm just talking about a bunch of music theory, because honestly, half of the battle is choosing good sounds, having good effects plugins, and good VSTs. But if you're struggling to make good chord progressions and good melodies in the first place, great sounds, great effect plugins, and great VSTs will not save you. To kind of give an analogy, if you build a really cool looking house on a super weak foundation, it's still going to be a super weak house. And the same thing goes for melodies. Having a great core musical idea is the first half of the battle. So let's dive into that. The first thing you need to understand about music theory, which is super beginner level, are keys and scales. Essentially, this is just a group of notes that work well together. And when you're making a melody, you want to make sure that all the notes you're using are staying inside of the scale. And technically, you can go out of scale once you get a little bit more advanced. But if you're just starting out, make sure you're staying in scale, because if you go out of key or out of the scale, stuff starts to sound really weird and not in a good way. And inside of those keys and scales, you can play melodies, but you can also play chords. And if you're a super beginner and you don't know what a chord is, essentially, it's just a group of 3 notes together that harmonize well and sound good when they're all played at the same time. And instead of boring you with a ton of crazy music theory in this video, I'm going to go in and show you a cheat code that you can start using in your DAW right now to make chord progressions without knowing too much music theory. So what you're going to want to do is just get any basic sound loaded up. I've got this piano right here. And then we're going to go into the MIDI right here. And the first thing that we're going to do inside of Logic is we're going to turn on the scale quantize. We're going to go to C, and then we're going to choose the natural minor scale. So there's 2 main scales that you can choose, a major scale and a minor scale. Minor scales tend to sound more dark, and major scales tend to sound more bright and happy. For me personally, working in the minor scale is the easiest one to do. So you want to set your scale quantize to the scale of your choosing. This will work in any scale. And then you want to grab this paintbrush tool right here. And essentially what this does is it will not let you place a note out of key. And if you're in FL Studio, you can use something called ghost notes that will essentially highlight the notes that are in the scale that you choose. Anyways, once you have this tool on, to build your very first chord, I'm just going to start on this C note right here. Since we're in C minor, it's the first note of the scale. Go right there. And this trick is very simple. All you're going to want to do is skip a note in the scale. So place a note on every other note in the scale. And you want to do that till you have 3 notes. So right now we have 1. The next note that it lets me click is here. Skip 1 here. This is the next note it lets me place, so I skip that note, every other note, until you get something like this. Sounds pretty good. And there's 2 main type of chords that you're going to be using with these triad chords. This one is a minor chord, and minor chords have a more dark sound, and the other kind is a major chord, which has a more bright, happy, uplifting kind of sound. The way that I like to think about minor chords is the bottom note has 2 spaces, and then the middle note has 3 spaces until the top note. And then for a major chord, you just invert that. So you move the middle note up 1, and then it's 3 spaces from the bottom to the middle and 2 spaces from the middle to the top. So now that you have a little bit of an understanding of what these chords are, let me show you how you can actually make a progression of them without knowing which ones mix and match well together. So with this scale lock on, I'm just going to click random notes in the scale, right? Like this. So no thought behind that. And then we're just going to use that skip a note in the scale trick with this scale quantize on to build each of these to have 3 different notes. So skip this note in the scale, lets me go there, skip 1 here, and look it, there's a minor chord. So now we're going to do the same thing here. Then we're going to do the same thing right here. And then again right here. Skip, skip, every other note. And then you get a full chord progression. And this is not the best chord progression, but my strategy, if I was you, is to come up with the bottom notes first and come up with a little bass line melody that you like, right? So I kind of like that right there. And I'm hearing this being a little bit more to the right. So we got something like this. Right? And then you just use that same skip a note in the scale technique. And then you get this. So just like that, you can make your own chord progressions that will work together and will stay in key. But the only problem with that is it sounds super robotic and boring and generic. So now I'm gonna give you 5 things that you can do to level up this exact chord progression that we just built. First thing that you can do is you can use that same trick to extend the chords. So instead of just leaving it at 3 notes, which is a triad chord, we're going to extend the chord and add more notes to the chord to make it a 7 chord. And 7 chords have 4 notes. You're just going to do that skip a note trick one more time, right? So skip this note here. Now you have a minor 7 chord. You hear how that sounds a little different than this? A little bit more emotional. And you could do this all the way up the keyboard. Skip a note, go right here. Skip a note, go right here. The more you add, the weirder it can sound, but it can also sound cool if you use it right. Right? So that sounds a lot more lush and luxurious. So I'm just gonna stick to 4 notes, the 7 chords, and I'm gonna extend all of these real quick. And then the chord progression should sound a little bit better. The next thing you could do to make them sound more interesting is to mess with the inversions. Inverting the chords is not adding any new notes, but just changing the actual octave that these notes are playing. So if I was gonna invert this chord progression, I might take these 2 top notes and put them down right here, and then maybe these notes right here and put them down right here. And then you get a completely different tonality, but it's still playing all the same notes. Right? And then maybe I would take these down too. So you just mess with the octaves like that. And it can make it sound a lot more exotic, even if it's a super basic generic chord progression. Now, the next thing that you could do is start to mess with the rhythm. So right now we have a super straightforward rhythm, but if I wanted to spice it up a little bit more, I could maybe move this over a little bit like this, maybe just have 1 note playing right there. And I'm not adding any new notes. I'm just going to be kind of moving everything to be playing in more interesting rhythms. And you could go crazy with this. You could add something right there, maybe another chord hit right there, and then change the inversions like this so that it's kind of going up. So all that is done without adding any new notes to this equation, just chopping stuff up and messing with the rhythm and the bounce of stuff. For this next tip, I undid those rhythm edits that I just did because this one is kind of similar, but you can arpeggiate. So essentially what that means is right now, everything's all starting at the same time, right? All those notes are playing all at once, all at once, all at once right there. Arpeggiating it would make it so it's playing more like bum, 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 bum. So to get this effect, all you would need to do is kind of move them like this off time, and then you could even repeat them like this and make your own little patterns. And you can get even crazier with this and let's say move this part up an octave. And then it sounds like you're playing a whole melody, but really it's just that 1 chord arpeggiated. The next thing you can do is add what I like to call sprinkle chords. So to do this, all you need to do is chop up your chord a few times like this, and then you're just going to put it up an octave each time, like this. And then this one goes up another octave, and then this one goes up another octave. And when you play it like this, it's going to sound very, very weird and robotic, but I'll show you how to fix that. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that all of these notes are going to play all the way through, and that's already going to sound a little bit smoother. Then the next thing you're going to do is strum these chords. So you're going to want to play them loosely and out of time instead of all playing straight right on the grid. And then once you do that, grab all these notes, lower the velocity a little bit so it's a little bit more gentle. And this is just a very quick example, but then you get something like this. And you could use that all the time in emotional and soulful melodies to make it sound like you're playing some crazy runs on the keys, or really you're just copying the chords up an octave, humanizing them a little bit by playing them strummed like that, and it just gives it a cool little vibe. Now that we've gone over chords a bit, we got to talk about melody. And in most cases, the melody is the super catchy part that's ear-grabbing and memorable, and the chords are more just the foundation that sets the emotion up and gives the melody space to shine. But unfortunately, melody is one of those things that's just kind of hard to put a science behind it. It really comes down to your personal style, your ear, and your creativity. Nonetheless, I do have a quick little tip once you have a chord progression built that'll help you come up with top-line melodies a little bit easier. All right, so for this tip, let's assume that you have a super simple chord progression like this one. What you want to do if you struggle to come up with top-line melodies, something that you can do to at least get comfortable making them, or to start off if you're struggling with inspiration, is to literally just copy the notes from inside the chords, right? So what you could do is you could copy the chord up an octave, and then you could start making a melody out of these notes. So you could mute these notes in your MIDI or just use them kind of as a guide, maybe bring them over here to make sure that you're hitting all the right notes. And then I'm just going to click in a little pattern following just these notes. So I'm literally just using notes from the chord. Let's copy that over a few times. And then from there, you don't have to stick strictly with the notes in the chords. You can start to mess with a few of the notes and put them in different notes of the scale. I might take these notes and make them a little bit longer. Right, so I'm using one note that's not in that chord, but it's still in the scale. And then this chord right here is just the same chord as this one, but pitched down 5. So I'm just going to copy this melody down 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then if I put that down an octave just to make sure, you could see that all those notes line up with the original chord, other than that one note right here that goes out of key, but I can go and just borrow another note from that first chord and bring this note to right here. And then I could just put that back up an octave right here. Then without thinking too much about how to make the melody and just kind of using notes from the chords, get something like this. Which obviously doesn't sound like much right now, but if you paired that with some cooler sounds, you could start to get somewhere. That technique can definitely get you started, but by far the best thing that I have done for my top-line melodies is learning to play the piano. And I know I'm going to lose a lot of people right here, but I've got an easy-ish way to kind of fake it till you make it, to learn the piano and learn the keys. So let me go through that right now. So the first thing you need to do is learn the notes on the piano. Just suck it up, spend a week, grab some index cards or use Quizlet or whatever you can use. I'm sure there's also apps and stuff like that online that you can quiz yourself and memorize every single note on the piano. And this is really not that hard to do because there's only 12 notes that you need to memorize. And once you've memorized every single note that's on the piano and someone can point to any note on the keyboard and you know which note it is, the next step is to choose one scale, memorize it, and stick with just that scale. You'll be able to get a lot better way quicker, and then you can just record that into MIDI and then pitch it up or down if you want your melody to be in a different scale. This is how I personally learned the keys. I chose C minor, so I learned that key by heart. I learned how to play all the chords. I learned how to improvise in that scale. And if I had to give you some recommendations, I would recommend A minor, which is all the white keys, E flat minor or D sharp minor, whichever one you want to call it, because it has all the black keys and only a few white notes. So that's an easier one to play as well. And then my personal favorite is C minor, because a lot of sound kits that you'll get and a lot of tools that you'll get will be tuned to C. But anyways, once you've done a little research and picked the key that you want to stick to, memorize every single note that's in that key until the point that your hand just knows where to go to play in that key, so it becomes second nature. Essentially, what you're going to want to do when you're practicing is you want to practice going up in the scale like this. And there's a ton of YouTube videos online that help you practice playing the scales up like this that I used. But essentially, you just want to get to the point that you can play it like that without even thinking about it, and then go back down. And then once you get to the level where you can just play up and down without messing up too much, then you can look up backing tracks in blank minor or whatever key that you chose to learn, and you can start improvising. You can practice playing up and down along with the backing track, or even a loop or something that you have that's in that scale that you're learning. You can practice doing that with a metronome, and then you can practice actually improvising, not just going up and down, but kind of messing around within the scale and creating your own little riffs and melodies. So without going any further and playing a bunch of crazy chord progressions on the keys, if you at least memorize all of the notes that are in the scale and you can kind of play them without thinking too hard about it, this is what's going to help you come up with a lot more interesting top line melodies than just clicking in and clicking random notes that are in the scale. Because when you could just play it in on the keys without thinking too much, you're going to get a lot cooler sounds, and honestly the workflow is just way more inspiring than just clicking in random notes on the MIDI. Then the next thing that you're going to want to do is learn all of the chords in that scale. So the same way that you learned every single note in the scale, now you're going to learn every single triad chord that works in that scale. So the next thing you want to do is essentially the same thing, just with some added difficulty. Instead of just playing the single notes like that, you want to play the actual 3-note chords up and down the scale like this. Which actually takes a lot of effort to be able to get fluid with that. And then once you learn that, you can start to add in the 4th note to make it a 7th chord like we were talking about earlier. So now you're going to be playing with 4 fingers at once. Which obviously I need a little practice on. And there's a ton of YouTube videos that you can follow along with and practice routines on YouTube that you can follow along with to kind of do that exercise until you get to the point where you can just improvise stuff like that without even thinking about it. And once you get that down, the sky is the limit. You can then progress to being able to play all the 7 chords in the scale. So that's 4 notes at a time instead of just the 3-note triad chords. Then you can build on top of that, play different inversions, all this kind of stuff, and get super advanced. But for most music producers, I feel like just being able to play the triad chords and maybe the 7th chords is going to be most of what you need. And the last tip that I want to give you is to force yourself to record everything on MIDI. Now this is going to suck for the first few months, but if you get really strict with yourself and you do not allow yourself to click in anything with MIDI, once you at least can play stuff on the keys a little bit and have memorized the chords at least a little bit, forcing yourself to learn how to play them in time and play cool ideas on the keys will get you better so much faster, and naturally you'll just be practicing every time you cook up instead of having to do dedicated practice time. It's going to help you work on your timing, your improvising, and all that kind of stuff. Knowing how to play the keys just makes making melodies way easier, chord progressions and melodies. And towards the end, I've actually got a crazy little cheat code that anyone can use. Even if you do not play the keys at all, you can start using it today, but I'll get into that more later. Now that we've gone over more of the composing part of making melodies, it's time to get into the other half of the battle, sound selection. Sound selection can determine the genre of the music, your style as a melody maker, and the overall quality of the music. Before we dive into how to improve your sound selection, the best VSTs, and all that kind of stuff, really quick, I just want to show you how big of a difference using good sounds can make by taking the exact same melody, the exact same notes, and on the first example, using some more cheap generic VST kind of sounds, and on the second example using some more expensive high quality kind of sounds, just to show how the same core melodic idea can completely transform just by using better quality sounds. As you can tell, even though they're the same core idea, they're playing the same notes, the second example feels way more professional and way more ear-grabbing just by using better sounds. And every single sound that you heard in that good version of the loop was from my new kit, Melody Mastery. It has a ton of amazing sounds using real live instruments, thousands of dollars worth of analog gear and synths, and so much more, all in one easy to access place so you don't have to spend hours digging through crappy presets just to find one good sound. It's also got a ton of melodic phrases with live flute, violin, guitar, trumpet, vocal samples from Grammy-nominated vocalists, pretty much every kind of sound that you would need to level up your sound selection and make your music sound more expensive. And as a thank you for watching the channel, if you use the code MASTER at checkout, you can get 30% off that huge bundle. So if you want to take the guesswork out of your sound selections, have all the best sounds in one place so you can make more expensive ear-grabbing melodies, click the first link in the description down below and don't forget to use that discount code. And now that I got the little self-promo out of the way, let's talk more about sound selection. Like I said, using great sounds like the ones inside of the Melody Mastery kit can really level up the quality of your music. You can also change the whole genre and vibe of a melody just by using different sound selection, different sound combinations. Take a listen to this example. I've got the same exact chord progression, pretty much the same MIDI, but with different sounds and instrument combinations being used to make up 3 completely different feelings. as you can tell, using the same core idea with different sounds can completely change the genre and feeling of the music. So to help you guys out, I'm gonna give you 10 go-to instrument or sound combinations that you guys can use in your music. So open your notes app or bookmark this part of the video, because you can steal these sound combinations and use them as kind of a cheat sheet that you know are gonna complement and work with each other. And to start off these sound combos, I wanna go over some hard-hitting ones that work really well for genres like trap music. Starting off with one of the easiest sound combos, we've got a piano, a lead violin, and some kind of strings in the background. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like. All right, so as you're listening to that, you can hear a top line played on the violin. You can hear that dark, evil piano in the background, and then you can also hear some big violin string chords that are kind of more in the background. And as far as the first instrument, piano, I would recommend going with Keyscape or the Piano V from Arturia. Those are my two go-tos for this kind of sound. And for lead violin, I would definitely recommend using real live violin phrases, because it just sounds so much better than any VST. But if you are dead set on using a VST, I would recommend Chris Hines solo strings, as well as the Spitfire solo violin. And then for the background strings that have more of a big cinematic sound and not as dry like the lead violins, you can use stuff like East West Opus, which has a ton of great strings. I use it all the time. Expand 2 has a ton of great strings in there as well, especially the tremolo presets. They sound amazing. And you can also use the Mellotron V, because it has some super good cinematic sounding string sounds. Next up, we've got a synth arp or synth lead with synth chords and a synth bass. This combination will never fail because synths just work really well with other synths. But let's take a listen to what this can sound like. All right, so as you could hear in that one, we have a synth arp or a synth lead kind of sound acting as the main kind of catchy idea. And we have some synth chords just kind of filling out the loop. And then the synth bass is just filling out the low end. And honestly, for all my synth sounds, the only VST I grab consistently has got to be Analog Lab or any of the VSTs from the Arturia V collection. And I'm not even just saying this, the Melody Mastery Analog Lab bank has been my go-to ever since I've made it. And I made a lot of the presets using the Prophet V VST and the Mini V VST that are part of Arturia's V collection. And for my last go-to combination for trap stuff, we've got guitar, flute, and synth chords. Let's take a listen to that. With this combo, I like to have the flute as the main melody. I like to have the guitar as the main kind of chord melody. And then the synth chords are really just there to kind of fill in and play the same chords as the guitar, but just kind of adding some atmosphere and depth to it, not really being the star of the show or trying to steal space from the flute or the guitar. And as far as guitars go, I really do not believe that there's any VSTs out there that cut it whenever you compare it to a real guitar. So personally, I would recommend just buying a guitar and sucking it up and learning how to play it. And as far as flutes go, I really would stick with live flutes as well. A flute is super hard to learn, so I would go with live flute phrases. And then as far as VSTs, there is the Ventus Bansuri contact bank, which I used to use all the time before I started working with session musicians. The Mellotron V also has that strawberry flutes preset, and if you sauce that up a little bit, you could definitely get some really good sounds out of that. And then for the synth chords, you could use Analog Lab, one shots, whatever you want. All right, next up, I've got 4 sound combos for some more emotional R&B leaning kind of melodies. And the first one that I have used countless times and it always works is a vocal sample with a piano, a synth bass, and some kind of synth pad. Here's some examples of what those sound like.
Oh, I am here right by your side.
All right, so as you could hear in that one, the piano acts as the main foundation with the main chord progression, and the vocal chop is acting as our top line melody. So you don't need to add a bunch of top line melodies here with different instruments. Essentially, you just want to build out the chords with the piano and let the vocal breathe and be the main catchy part of the sample. And then for the synth pad and the synth bass, those are just following the piano chord progression and just kind of playing the same MIDI as the piano. So vocals are definitely a very key part of this sound combination. And I think your best bet is using packs like Melody Mastery or even using sites like Splice. I used to use Splice all the time for my vocal samples. For the piano, I really like using Keyscape and also the Lab Soft Piano from Spitfire. And then again, for the synths, I would just use Analog Lab personally. Next up, we've got an electric piano with a vocal chop, a synth pad, and an upright bass.
Baby, are we okay? Been feeling something in my gut all day. Is this something that you wanna say? You better spit it out, I'm about to go crazy.
All right, so as you could hear in that one, it's got kind of a similar vibe to that first one, but it's just a little bit of a different tone, mostly because you're using an electric piano versus a acoustic piano for the chords. But the electric piano is going to be the main foundation of the chords in the loop. The vocal chop is again acting as the top line melody. You can layer in that synth pad, just kind of following the electric piano just to fill it out a little bit more. And then instead of using a synth bass, I like to use an upright bass just because it kind of gives off a different texture. But you could totally swap that out for a synth bass. Anyways, my favorite kind of electric piano VSTs to use are from Keyscape, but also the Stage 73V from Arturia is super good for that R&B key kind of sound. Vocals again from Splice or from Sound Kits, the synths from Analog Lab, and then for the upright bass, I really like the stock Logic presets. I use those all the time, but if you don't have stock Logic, you can find an upright bass one shot and just use that. All right, for the next one, we've got guitar with synth chords with a vocal and a synth bass. This sound combination is super versatile. You can either go for some super sexy like 90s R&B kind of stuff or some more emotional kind of stuff. Well, let's take a listen. So as you can hear, the guitar is acting as the main instrument in this sound combination. And the synths are really just kind of building on top of it and complementing it instead of trying to compete with it and do some crazy weird switch up or anything like that. And then on this specific loop, I didn't use a vocal chop, but you could definitely throw in a super subtle vocal chop on this kind of loop. And as far as guitars go, again, I really don't think that any VSTs compare. So your best bet is using real live guitar phrases from Kits or Splice. Get your own guitar. And then for the synth pads, basses, and leads and all that, I would just use Arturia again. And lastly, for the R&B, we've got a synth pad, a synth lead, a synth bass, and an optional vocal chop. So as you can hear on that one, we still have a vocal sample, but it's much more focused on the synths than it is on having a crazy vocal phrase. So whenever I'm trying to use a synth lead and a vocal at the same time, I really like to either use a very subtle synth lead that just kind of accents a crazy vocal line, or the flip, a simple vocal chop that leaves a lot of room for you to play some crazy melodies on a synth lead. And then as far as the VSTs on that, you can guess what I'm going to say. Analog Lab, Arturia, the Melody Mastery Analog Lab Bank all work super well for these kind of sounds. All right, and for these last three sound combinations, we've got some more vintage leaning stuff that's good for 60s and 70s gospel and soul kind of sample. The first one being super good for more gospel leaning stuff. We've got piano with organ, live bass, vocals, and live drums.
Shine your light on me.
So as you can hear, that sounds super great. And this sound combination I find works really well when you have a very full and big sounding vocal that can kind of steal the show. Most of the time with this sound combination, I have the piano as the main chord instrument, and I think of the organ kind of as a pad that's just filling out and adding this soulful vintage atmosphere, this churchy kind of vibe. The drums are just super subtle to just kind of add to that vintage sampled kind of feeling. And then the live bass is just there to fill out the low end. And as far as the pianos go, I would definitely say live piano is the best for these vintage kind of loops, just because all of the instruments back then were actually recorded live. There wasn't VSTs back in the 60s and 70s. But if you want some VST options, Keyscape's upright piano presets sound amazing. Teletone Audio has a great bank called the Golden Age Grand that I actually used in the soul sample that I made for Future, SZA, and DJ Khaled called Beautiful. And I would use the Abbey Road 60s and 70s drummers for the drums. For the live bass, I would use the Scarby Rickenbacker bass from Contact. For the organ, I like to use the UAD Waterfall organ. It sounds so amazing. I get asked all the time what organ I use in my soul samples, and I rarely use a real organ. It's almost always that one. And then from vocals, kind of the same thing as the R&B loops, I would go into the Melody Mastery Kit or onto Splice. This next one is a little bit more complex, but it works really well for that smooth 70s soul kind of vibe. It's a guitar with a Rhodes, violin, brass, which is trumpets, trombones, stuff like that, live drums, live bass, and vocals. Here's an example of what that sounds like.
Losing you. Oh, it's tearing me apart.
All All right, so as you can hear, this one is a little bit more complex. The way that I typically build these is I have Rhodes and guitar playing the main chords. I've got the live bass filling out the bass line, the drums adding that bounce and kind of sample texture. And then I use the violin and brass as kind of just supporting melodies that are more in the background, just kind of accenting little melodic themes that are going on inside of the vocals. The vocals are super, super key to this one. But anyways, for the sounds, definitely for these vintage samples, you want to use live guitar. It just sounds so much better. You can also use UAD Electra 88 keys for the Rhodes. This is really the only electric piano VST that I use whenever I'm making these soulful kind of samples. So definitely check that out. For the violins, I'm mainly using East West Opus. And then for the brass, I'm using the stock Logic brass. It sounds super good, surprisingly. For the live drums, I'm using that 60s and 70s drummer bank that I was talking about earlier, that Scarby Rickenbacker bass. And again, vocals from Splice or Sound Kits Online. For the organ, I like to use the UAD Waterfall organ. It sounds so amazing. I get asked all the time what organ I use in my soul samples. And lastly, another combination that works super, super well is one that doesn't use vocal samples, but relies more on violins. And this is going to be a piano or a Rhodes, either or you can combine them. A violin, flute, and brass. Also add in some live bass and some super subtle live drums. All right, so as you could hear, that one still has a super soulful kind of vibe, but it's not relying as heavily on vocals. The violin, flute, and brass kind of work together to be the main melody on this one, and I really, really like using this sound combination. I have the piano or the Rhodes, or sometimes I combine both of them, playing some super drawn out chords that leave a lot of room for a violin to do a crazy top line melody, and then I just kind of support the little melodic themes that I write with the violin with the flute or brass instrument here and there. And for the keys, it's pretty much the same VSTs we talked about. Keyscape, the UAD Electra 88 keys for electric piano. Actual live recorded piano sounds the best, of course. I use East West Opus for the flutes and the violins. Mellotron V also has some super good brass and flute sounds, but I really, really do like the stock Logic brass, the Rickenbacker bass, and again, those 60s and 70s drummer banks from Contact. Those sound combos are great, but definitely don't take those as the only sound combinations that you can use. Those are just some good combos that I go to all the time whenever I don't feel like creating something completely new, and they almost never fail and always work together. Anyways, before we get into the next topic, I want to give you guys just a few more pointers on sound selection. The first thing being that it takes a ton of time to work on sound selection. It's one of those things that you can't just turn on and decide one day that you're going to start choosing better sounds. It takes years of listening to different types of music, improving your music, getting better VSTs, getting better sounds, and also developing your ear to be able to even choose good sounds. And most of the time, the best advice I can give to someone working on sound selection is to just make a lot of music for a long period of time, and you'll kind of pick up on it naturally as you continue to improve and get better. But I want to leave you with some practical advice. So I think one of the best things you can do to learn sound selection, especially if you're learning a new genre or you're just a beginner to making music in general, is studying your favorite music. So for example, I'm going to listen to one of my own samples because I don't want to get a copyright claim on YouTube, but I would listen to the sample and just be trying to pick out all the different sounds that I hear, right? So right away I can hear drums, so I know I got drums. I hear vocals, that's the first thing I notice. Then I can start to hear kind of a guitar. If I'm listening closely, I can hear violins in the back, that like tremolo, like da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? I can kind of hear an electric piano.
It's tearing me apart. It's breaking my heart. Baby, stay with me.
Right there, I could hear like a little trumpet hit. Right, so I'm just kind of picking up on all these things and how they're being used and kind of adding that to my mental arsenal of just tools that I can use and ways that I can use instruments. Another thing you can do that's super similar to this that I used to do in the past is I would grab loop kits from my favorite loop makers and then I would study the stems of their samples. Not to try to steal their stuff, but just so I could see what they were doing to put together these samples that sound super complex and crazy, and to kind of demystify it in my head and be like, oh, it's really just a piano with a bell, with the bass, with the vocal. It's really not that much. It just sounds crazy when it's all put together. The next tip is a great way to make stuff that is unique but still has a more familiar feeling that works with today's modern music is to use common melodies and chord progressions that you hear in a lot of today's music, but instead of using the typical sounds that people associate with that kind of melody, you can swap it out for some different sounds, similar to this. The next thing I want to talk about with sound selection is using real instruments and live gear as much as you can. And I know a lot of people do not have access to thousands of dollars of studio equipment, don't know how to play instruments and all that kind of stuff, but I would definitely recommend picking up some instruments and learning those, collaborating with people who actually play those instruments, or if you don't want to do any of that, you can use tools like Splice or the Melody Mastery Kit that have tons of live instrument recordings that you can use in your music, because there's some things that you really just can't replicate with VSTs. No matter how expensive of a sound bank you get, just sounds like a computer generated fake recording. Just for some quick pointers, I think the instruments that you absolutely cannot get away with using VST versions of are guitars, lead violins. The flute is really hard to get away with VST versions. And lastly, live brass like trumpets and saxophones. If you're trying to do a lead melody line where it's playing solo by itself, doing a bunch of crazy runs, it's just gonna sound kind of cheap if you do it with a VST. So specifically for those instruments, I would definitely recommend collabing with someone, picking up an instrument yourself, or using phrases from something like Melody Mastery, Splice, or any of those kind of websites. I know this has been a ton of talking, and like I mentioned earlier in this video, I'm gonna get into a ton of easy to use Saucy tips in the end of the video. But for now, let's move on to one of the most important parts of making melodies: arrangement and simplicity. Everyone always preaches that you should keep your beats, your melodies simple, but making super attention grabbing melodies that are still simple in nature is actually really hard to do. On one hand, if you overdo it and add too many elements, it sounds crowded and it's hard for an artist to rap or sing over, or for someone to add drums and make a full beat with it. And on the other hand, if you don't do enough, it can just sound super bland and boring and doesn't really grab the listener's ear. And like we talked about with sound selection, using good sounds can go super far in having a melody that only has 3 layers sound super full and super interesting. But in this section, I want to talk less about sound selection and more about how to organize and arrange your melodies out to be more simple. First thing you need to do is commit to the main idea or the gimmick of the melody. I was talking with my boy Vitals, who's worked with Kanye West, Chris Brown, Ty Dolla $ign, and so many other huge artists. And one of his biggest pieces of advice that is still stuck with me is to stop trying to dress a shitty idea up in gold. And I couldn't agree more. Essentially, he's saying that a lot of producers are trying to take their mid, not interesting ideas and add a ton of phrases and accents and textures on top of it to make it interesting, instead of spending more time and effort working on the core idea or the gimmick of the melody. A lot of the biggest mainstream hit melodies have a super catchy, ear-grabbing, and memorable gimmick or theme to them. Take a listen to the melody on these songs, and I think you'll know what I mean.
Debo, any rap nigga, he a freak throw, man down, call like Amber Lamps.
Percocet, Miley Percocet, Percocet.
Notice how in all of them, there's a super ear-grabbing melody that's infectious and just sticks in your head. This is what you want to try to create with your melodies. It's so easy to keep adding sound on sound, counter melody on counter melody, almost out of some fear that we have in our heads that it's not good enough yet. But as melody makers, we need to work more on committing to one main idea in the loop and not just adding on a ton of sounds that are competing with that main idea. So I'm going to go into the DAW right now on a project of mine that's got some melodies and layers that are just kind of clashing. And I'm going to show you how to fix that to make sure that it's focused on one main idea. All right, so if we go in here, you can see that we've got quite a few layers in this loop. I just dragged all of the stems on a loop that I've already made all together. And if we play it all at once, you can hear that there's a bunch of like cool sounds going on, but it's so jumbled together that you can't really make out anything that's going on. So the first thing we need to do to fix that is commit to what the main sound, the main kind of idea and driving force for the whole sample is. So what I'm going to do now is go through and listen through all these stems until I find the one that I think just grabs my ear the most when I listen to it soloed out. And if you're already in the middle of making your melody, you might have a better idea on what that sound is already. But after listening for a while, I decided that this is kind of the main ear-grabbing sound in this melody. This little synth art. And obviously that's not as catchy as something like Not Like Us or Mask Off. And not every melody has to be super gimmicky like that, but you definitely want to work on building that main idea rather than taking away from it by adding too much. So I want the first section to come in with this because the first section of your sample is the most important. Whenever someone's clicking through loops to use or just clicking through songs, the first few seconds that they hear is going to be their first impression of the track. And if right away it doesn't grab their ear, they might skip and listen to or go use something else. So I definitely want this playing right off the bat. And the strategy that I like to use use to keep all of these layers and keep this kind of complex sample with all these ideas is to actually arrange them out into multiple sections so that they're not all playing at the same time and each sound has its own space. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just delete a bunch of sounds from this first section, and I'm just gonna go through and listen to see which ones clash with this one, right? These two are definitely clashing, right? They're both kind of like top line, high frequency ideas. Take that out. It sounds a lot more clear now what's going on. This one's not clashing as much. I might turn it down, but this is more like a chord sound. Still leaving room for that main catchy element. Now this is still a chord sound, but it's clashing a little bit, so I might take it out for this section. This sound could work if I turn it down a little bit. Let's hear what this sounds like. That kind of works well because it only comes in every once in a while. We got this low end piano. That's not clashing too much because it's playing in the low end. Nothing else is really there right now. And then this really high lead synth sound. You could even argue that that could be the main gimmick. But I'm still going to go with that first one, so I'm definitely going to take this out because that is definitely clashing with everything we've got going so far. So now the first section still has enough elements that it's ear-grabbing. But it's not so crowded that you can't even make out what's happening, like when you play it all together like this. And now moving on, a lot of people might just, you know, delete one sound and then have this B section be pretty much the same thing. But what I like to do for my B sections is make it not feel like a complete sample switch up, but I like to really swap out a lot of the sounds, or maybe half speed the chord sounds, half speed a lead sound, stuff like that to make it feel like it's a completely different section of the sample. And not just like it's an 8-bar loop with one sound coming in and out for the whole arrangement of the loop. So I'm going to take this main sound out that we were using right there. I'm going to take out these low chords and just use the high chords from earlier. Let's also maybe take out this little synth sound right here and that little counter melody synth sound that kind of did that call and response. So now we have like one sound that's carrying over, this bass piano that's kind of tying everything together. And I haven't listened to this yet, but let's see how that sounds for a B section. We have that synth lead coming in. Might take this out. See, now we have like a complete different section that would, you know, could be used for a hook, whereas this could be used for a verse or an intro. And then from there, I'm just trying to do the same thing with my arrangement throughout the whole rest of the sample, create as many different sections as I possibly can. That would give someone using this melody a lot of different ideas and freedom to flip it in a bunch of different ways, instead of just being locked into the same thing arranged over and over again. Now that we went over that, let's assume that we've got a good main melody, we've got good chords, good composition, good sound selection, and a good arrangement and organization with the melody. Assuming all of that is figured out, there's one big problem that a lot of producers still face: mixing. You can have amazing ideas for your melodies, great sounds, and all that kind of stuff, but if it's mixed terribly, it'll just hold back the melody from reaching its true potential. And while it would be impossible for me to go over everything about mixing in one short section of a video, I want to go over some big and common mistakes that I see people making with their melody mixes all the time and show you how you can fix them. So let's dive right into that. All right, for all these mixing mistakes, I'm going to use that same project file from earlier. And the first mistake that I see all the time in people's melody mixes is having too much low, mid, and frequencies, because these frequencies are going to add a lot of boominess and muddiness to your melody. And when you combine that with drums in an 808, it's just going to sound super muddy and messy and just ruin the whole mix. So if we take a listen to this melody, it doesn't sound bad, but the mix is definitely a bit muddy right now. If I was to try to add an 808 on top of that, which is a great thing that you can do to test if there's too much low end, I'll just draw in a super generic 808 pattern real quick, just so I can hear how it sounds. And hear how the 808 sounds like it's almost being ruined by the melody, like the melody is drowning everything out, right? So the first thing I'm gonna do is just lower the volume of everything a little bit. And then I'm gonna go in on all these sounds that have a lot of low to mid end, and I'm going to take the EQ and duck that down, right? So we go from this to this. We're still keeping all of the body and the energy of the sound. We're not completely grabbing out all the low end like this, right? We still have that fullness, but we're taming that muddy mid frequency range right there. I'm gonna do the same thing on this sound right here. I like to bring it up here to hear that ugly frequency more, and then cut it out. And then again on this pianos especially, right? We have a ton of low end going on right here. Subtle change, but I promise you it's gonna make your mixes so much cleaner. All right, the next problem that I see all the time is having too many sounds in one frequency range. So that might be having two lead melodies playing on top of each other that are both in the same octave and clashing with a lot of the frequencies. Like if we listen right here, you can hear that these two together, they kind of sound cool, but there's so much going on in that high frequency that you cannot separate out and really hear a difference between those layers. No one layer has room to breathe. It just sounds like a bunch of high-end synth stuff going on. So the first fix you could try is open up an EQ on each one of these and see where the frequencies are playing at. You'll see that a lot of the frequencies are all playing in the same kind of range, right? But this sound right here is more shining in the high end, and this one's a little bit lower. So I'm gonna take the high end of this one and kind of tame it a little bit, and then let this one breathe a little bit more. And when that's not enough, like in this case, it still sounds like it's clashing. There's a few other things that you can do. The first one being trying to pan one left and one right. So a lot of times people have these melodies all jammed up right up the middle, but if you can pan them left and right, you can add a little bit of stereo separation. So you're hearing one melody more in your left ear, one melody more in your right ear, and it gives the illusion that they have a little bit more space and they're not clashing so hard, even though they're both playing at the same time. So we could try that here. And I'll do this a little bit more dramatic than I would actually do in a finished sample, just to show you guys, really prove the point that I'm talking about, right? But now, I mean, it sounds a little weird, it's too far. But now, I feel like I can actually like hear both of those sounds, compared to when they're both playing in the middle like this. All right, so just pan it a little bit. It not only makes your sample feel bigger, but it gives each little sound its own space to shine. But let's say you're still not satisfied with it. It still sounds like it's clashing a little bit and like you can't really tell what's going on. It sounds a little weird. The next thing I would really recommend doing is trying to half speed one of the layers, right? So I'm gonna put on this plugin right here and half speed that really bright, loud synth layer. And now you can hear that they separate a lot better than this. And if I didn't like it on that sound, I could try it on the other one. Just a lot of trial and error. Right? I think I like that better, actually. I could even change the half speed so it's keeping the original vibe a little bit more. All right, one of the next biggest mistakes that I see people making with their melodies is adding too many crazy effects. Especially when you're a beginner, it can be easy to have an idea that doesn't sound super ear-grabbing and cool on its own. So you go to crazy effects like Portal or any of those really weird effects that can completely flip a sound and try to save your idea by using those plugins. But like I was saying earlier, you can't really dress a shitty idea up in gold. But your aim should be to make good core ideas that don't need a ton of special effects to sound nice, and to use the effect plugins to enhance those ideas and just make them sound a little bit more attention grabbing rather than fixing shitty ideas and just trying to flip them into something random. All right, the next mixing mistake that I see all the time is overdoing it with effects, specifically reverb and delays. So just to give you guys an example of what a lot of people's loops sound like that I listen to on a day-to-day basis, I'm just gonna add some reverb on every single channel in here. And although it might sound good on each individual stem, right? Like, it sounds kind of cool with all that reverb. When you mix it all together, it can just start to sound like some like sonic mush is what I like to call it, right? So with all the reverb, it sounds like this. It also starts to add a lot of muddiness, right? And if I even just take it away on maybe the main sound right here, already sounds a lot better. Take it away on more, and then it sounds a lot better. And obviously that's a very dramatic example. I really wanted to prove that point, but I feel like a lot of you guys just keep adding effects, adding Portal, adding weird delays, weird reverbs, all these different effects to try to mask that you're not using very good sounds in the first place, and you just end up making something that doesn't really sound like a melody. It just sounds like some weird melodic texture. Now that we got some of those mistakes out of the way, real quick, I just want to run you through my 3 favorite effect plugins that I use in almost every single sample. So my first essential plugin that I use in almost every sample is H delay. And this is an awesome, great go-to delay. You can get very simple delays, something like this. Something very simple like that, but you can also get very, very interesting sounds, which is why I personally like using this. So I mess with the modulation knob and I turn the depth up and the rate up, which kind of detunes the delay. Take a listen. You hear that like weird effect? And obviously that's a little bit too much, so I would just do it a little bit more subtle. You can automate the time to get this weird effect. You can also EQ the delay right here. And I use this all the time. The next essential plugin, I feel like I don't even really need to show what it does because it's just Valhalla Vintage Verb. This is pretty much the only reverb that I use unless I'm using a very specific reverb for something. And it just has a great kind of sound to it. Now this next plugin, I don't see as many people using, but this is definitely one of my staple plugins. It's called Decimort 2, which is a bit crusher, which might seem really weird to be on your top list of plugins, but I don't use this for the bit crusher. Normally you would use a bit crusher for an effect like this. Some kind of like 8-bit Nintendo sounding stuff. But if you turn on this button, it turns into like the Drake underwater filter. I use this all the time in my R&B stuff, and recently I've been using it a lot in my trap stuff too, to make stuff sound a little bit grittier, a little bit more analog when I'm using synth sounds by turning up this preamp knob right here. So if we go to this more synth leaning section right here, if I wanted to make this feel a little bit more gritty like it was recorded on real analog synths, I would just turn up this preamp knob, which just turns up the volume and gives it this like distorted kind of character. Right? Just adds a really nice filter effect. So those are the go-to third-party plugins that I use in almost every sample. And this last one I won't count because it's not just one specific plugin, but it's stock plugins. I feel like a lot of producers, especially when you're more a beginner, you can fall in the trap of thinking that what you have isn't good enough. But for basic effects like EQs, compressors, reverbs, delays even, you can definitely get away with stock stuff and make stuff that sounds great. And like I said, there's so much more that goes into mixing that I just can't fit into this video, but I did do a whole section in the Melody Mastery course that's over an hour and a half long on mixing, where I went over more tips, effects, plugins, and even show myself mixing a melody 100% from scratch. So if you have Melody Mastery or you grab that kit, definitely check that out. But as promised, now I want to get into some crazy saucy tips that are super easy to use that you can start using today. Whether you don't know any music theory and you're brand new to making melodies, or you've been making melodies for years, I bet there will be a tip or two in here that you haven't used yet. All right, so earlier, if you remember, I told you I had a cheat code that made it sound like you were crazy on the keys when you really have no idea what you're doing. So that's what I'm going to show you first. Essentially, what you want to do is grab a sound of your choice. I feel like this could work on a lot of different sounds, but I found that it works really, really well with a synth lead sound or some kind of synth sound. So I grabbed this random stock lead from Logic, ground it in H delay, and then I'm going to show you what it sounds like before I explain why it works. So I've got this synth starter, and I'm really just going to solo using these black notes to make something sound like this. So obviously when you look at this MIDI, it looks ridiculous. Like, how could someone play this in? But as you saw, it takes no talent at all. I was just moving my arm around like that on the keyboard. But the reason that this sounds so good is because all the black notes are playing in the pentatonic scale together, which, not to get too nerdy and technical, essentially it's a group of 5 notes that work really, really well inside of the scale together. And the big key to making this trick work is you want to use some kind of loop or starter that you're recording on and make sure that it's in E flat minor or D sharp minor. They're the same thing. Reason being, inside of the key of D sharp minor, all of those black notes are in the scale. All right, this next little tip is for my people out there who struggle to make one-shot sound good. I know that me personally, I am not the biggest one-shot user, and I find a lot of the times it's just because they sound kind of tinny, they sound kind of cheap. But recently I've been working more with one-shots, making this Melody Mastery kit, and I figured out a little bit of sauce. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is just grab a good one-shot to start with. Say we like this one. Just gonna drag that into my one-shot sampler, and typically, you know, just be playing around on the keyboard. Like, I kind of like the octave that it's in right now. Do you hear how cheap and just tinny it kind of sounds? The reason is because the higher you play it up, if you just watch this waveform as I play, right? If I play at a very low octave, it will play through the sample really slowly. It sounds a little bit more expensive sounding. But if I wanted a pattern up here, I'm gonna put that pattern down real quick. One thing that's really easy is just putting it down an octave. That still sounds cheap, so I'm going to make sure that all the notes kind of play out a little bit longer. And then I'm gonna bounce that to audio. And then I'm gonna pitch it up to where I want it to go. So let's pitch it back up an octave. And then let's add some reverb to kind of soften up those artificial sounds. So we started with the pattern like this. That sounds super artificial and fake. But if you just play it in a lower octave, then bounce it to audio, then pitch it up, you can get something like this. Which I don't know about you, it's not perfect, but that's definitely a big difference. All right, this next tip is for if you've ever had a melody in your head that you just can't get out. What you could do is you can grab your iPhone, record a voice memo. That might be hard to remember and then try to click in the MIDI and then all of a sudden you click the wrong note. I just remember getting frustrated by that a lot when I was beginning. So what you could do is airdrop that to your computer or email it to yourself, however you get it to your computer, and then drag it into your DAW like this. Right, so I have that little idea in my head, but that might be hard to translate to MIDI. So one thing that you can do to kind of cheat your way if you have Logic is click this little flex button right here and then go to flex pitch. And what this is going to do is it's going to show you the notes that you are at least trying to hit, and this will help you at least get a starting point to be able to remake this melody. So I can say I went G to D sharp, some middle notes in between, then down to D, and then it goes B, D. And now that I at least have a starting point of what notes I can use, I can go in the MIDI and try to recreate that. And if you don't have Logic, you can use Melodyne to do this, which is an expensive piece of software. So if you're on FL Studio, I believe you can use a stock plugin called Newtone that does something similar, but definitely a good technique to use if you have melodies stuck in your head that you can't transcribe into MIDI. All right, the next tip that I have for you is going to help you make instruments like flute, violin, trumpet, and all that sound a little bit more realistic and just a little bit more interesting. And you can also do this with vocal samples. So let's say I wanted to add in a flute line. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play it in at a super slow BPM. And then once I have that, instead of just speeding it up to a faster BPM, I'm gonna bounce it to audio before I do that. And then I'm gonna time stretch it back to that 113 that we started at, and it's gonna sound a lot more realistic. Or at least a lot more interesting. Not my best work at all, but I promise you, try using that on your lead lines. It sounds super cool. All right, this next tip is actually more of a sound design tip that I started doing whenever I was making this melody mastery kit to make some really, really weird sounding one-shots. So essentially, I'm gonna grab any sound. It can be a VST sound, it can be a one-shot, it can be a recording from a real instrument, whatever it is, right? Let's just grab this one for now. So what I do is I'll load this in as a one shot, and then I'm gonna create some kind of MIDI where I'm just playing the one shot all on C notes, but across a bunch of different octaves, right? And at random timing intervals. So I'm just gonna go up here and then like kind of put that down there, put it down here, right there, maybe up right there, then back down to this C, put one right there. So these are all C notes, right? And it sounds super weird on its own. And then I'm gonna add some crazy delay on there. And then we get this weird like pedal sounding texture without adding any weird crazy effects. And if you play that in as a one shot, you can get some super weird trippy sounds. So you could definitely experiment with that and get really crazy results. So definitely try that out. All right, and then for the next tip, I'm gonna steal a little bit of sauce from my boy Theta. He did this all over the loop kits inside of Melody Mastery, and I haven't really seen anyone do this very consistently. So essentially what he does is he does these little 1-bar intros with really weird, trippy sounds before the loop drops. And I think that what this does is because it starts in such an unorthodox and weird way, grabs the listener's attention, and then the rest of the loop seems more unique, even if you just heard the loop by itself. The way that it comes in just sounds so crazy. Take a listen to some of these. Right? Super simple effect, but that I feel like it grabs you. My boy Never Odd did it on this loop too. And these intros sound crazy, but I really don't think it'd be that hard to make something like that. So to just show you guys real quick how you could do something, if I have a full finished loop right here, just drag in one from the kit, and I wanted to make an interesting intro for this, I could just grab elements from the loop that are already there. Right? Like I could probably grab that, and then maybe that part right there. Bounce those down as audio files, and then let's put those in the intro, but instead of just leaving them like this, all right, which still sounds a little bit interesting, I'm going to reverse it to just get a different kind of effect. And then I'm also going to double speed it, playing twice as fast. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this little chord hit right there, but maybe just leave it at a normal speed. Right? And just like that, I mean, we get like a super interesting sounding intro that I wouldn't have normally added. And that's pretty much it for the quick tips that I can think of today. Overall, making melodies is an art that takes years to master. And I remember in the beginning feeling hopeless when learning how to make my own melodies, but it's probably the single best thing that I did in my career as a producer. I know it can be super tempting to just grab a pre-made loop, add some drums on in 15 minutes, instantly get that gratification of creating something that sounds good. But making your own melodies can bring a ton more opportunities. And in my opinion, once you learn how to do it, it's way more fulfilling and way more fun than just using pre-made samples and adding drums to them. So if you're just getting started on this journey, just know that the first few months are the hardest, and after that, it only gets better from there. And one more time before I go, if you want some help along the way learning melodies, if you click the first link in the description down below, you can get all the tools and knowledge that you need to level up your melody. That melody mastery bundle comes with a 10-hour course where I teach you guys a ton of stuff that I know about making melodies. It's also got lessons from other Grammy-nominated producers. The sound kit in there has thousands of sounds, presets, and all that good stuff. So use that code MASTER for 30% off of Melody Mastery. But even if you don't grab that, I appreciate you for watching, and I hope that you learned a thing or two in this video. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.